My name is Tim Carter, and of course, I pastor Landmark Missionary Baptist Church. This is originally why the entire YouTube channel was begun, to help members of Landmark Missionary Baptist Church in Jacksonville, Arkansas, since a new wave of something called apologetics had really gone out there. The first thing I noticed for them was to tell them there's an apologetic that is biased. That is, it supports Calvinism, for example. So these apologists apologize, give a rationale for their Calvinism, which is very valid and legitimate. Then there's an apologetic that is biased toward Arminianism, and they give a rationale for their Arminianism, which again is valid if you want to understand what is their rationale. But it's often the case, if I begin as a Calvinist, I can then prove my Calvinism. If I begin as an Arminian, I can prove it. I've never really found myself incapable of proving something I already believed. Then Molinism, for example, is probably one of the most, it's nothing that Molina would recognize today. It's so much more advanced and developed. It's probably just Molina, or Molinism is now a byword for it, because if you go to Reasonable Faith, Dr. William Lane Craig, there will be no greater, as far as robust thinking, elucidation of logic and rationale, than what he can afford and provide through his resources. Again, this is a language-based, probably the lowest level as far as what's regarded and respected out there. Talk is always more highly valued. Men want to hear what another man says. People say, "What do you say?" And brother so-and-so says this. So speaking of that, I'll go over just a little bit about the difference between talk and text. Back some time ago at 2000, when the new millennium was going to begin, and people were very concerned about something called Y2K, there were actually experts who had actual knowledge and were broadcasting that information, saying that would not happen, that it was not a possibility, that everything would shut down. But people that marketed to the fears and to the people in mass, if you will, proceeded. And coincidentally, a lot of the networks and even radio broadcasts who bought into it and sold people into that fear, the very next day already had new products and new material ready, demonstrating that even they had not bought into it in actuality and practice, but they certainly sold a lot of people. But what I learned from him specifically, one person who produced much information about it, was he was talking about the difference between talk and fact, if you will, or what we would say talk or text is what I like to call it. And there is a presumption we all make as talkers. Now, I was taught this, especially in any academic environment. When you walk in, if you have a good professor, he'll want to hear what you have to say, and you really buy into that, and you might start talking, or I did, and then you find out he really wants you to hear what you have to say, and then ask yourself, what's the difference between what you're saying and what's written? And for example, I like to interview people and say, what's your opinion of calculus, or what's your opinion of chemistry, or what's your opinion of physics? And if they haven't studied those, they'll just say, I don't know calculus, or I don't know chemistry, or I don't know physics, or I didn't do well in math, or I didn't do well in chemistry. Meaning they don't want to talk about something they don't understand. But now, if you say something about the Bible, for example, why people will just begin to bombard you with talk. Well, they already have the world figured out. They already know who they like. They already know what denomination they love and what they're in. They already know the religion of their choice. They already have their arguments ready. One man was arguing with me once, and I wasn't participating. But he was going on to the next point, counterpoint, assuming that he knew what I would say next, and he was arguing. And I just finally had to stop him and say, I don't know what you're talking about, but I'm not making that point. I just want to know what the text says. Well, for most people, the Bible is not an actual knowable book. If you listen to them, it's just in the room while they're talking, or it's in their hand while they're asserting something or adamantly affirming something. But there is a, a description of all of us, and it says our own mental constructs, that's our knowledge. What we build in our mind, that's our knowledge. It says human beings are becoming Gnostic creatures, constituting themselves, determining their universe by symbols of our own making. And that's hard to admit for some people, because we'd like to think that we're not imagining so much. We'd like to think that we're being honest with the Bible, for example. That's why when Eve gave Adam that apple, and we know it doesn't say apple anywhere in the Bible, and it's harmless, and we all laugh it off, or we'll say other things in the Bible and we'll teach it, and we'll say God helps those who help themselves, and it's not written anywhere. I remember believing that when you went to a wedding and you saw a pastor or a minister standing there, that what he was saying about, do you, Joe, take Susie to be your lawfully wedded wife to have and to hold, I thought that was in the Bible. And when I found out that wasn't in the Bible, that was a liturgical book that was written for the purpose of a ceremony like that. There was just so many things that I had constructed in my mind based on the things others had constructed in theirs. But when we don't find ourselves willing to be honest with our own imagination, we'll just never learn the text, for example. Now, I personally was brought to a point in my life where I wanted to know what the text said. Now, that was priority one, that's it. So I had to give up my mental constructs. But this is another to complete the comment. He says, as with ancient Gnostics, the traditional codes no longer determine our meaning. The traditional canon no longer has authority. He says a vast revisionary will is at work in our culture. And this was written in an article called The Postmodern Term, 1997. Well, it's really something that's always been true, but in this case, he's pointing out people have an aversion to authority. For example, if you're in a religion and your religion doesn't like, let's say, something the Bible teaches, well, it's because it would be holding authority over them and prevent them from going in a direction they want to go. So they would just revise it. It's called the error of emendation, or in our common words, just we revise it or we ignore it. And that's typical of all of us. We really don't like the parts that hold authority over us. But back to what I have done in apologetics, especially as a pastor, I want them to know what the text says first. Now, they can continue on. For example, I tell people I'm a pre-trib rapturist, but I just don't have a text to support it. I can't find what I prefer in the Bible. I prefer the King James version of the Bible, but I don't know about the Cambridge edition or the Oxford. I've not evaluated those, and really I don't know if I have the energy to try it. But I can't defend that except to say that it's a valid English translation in the public domain, and it's like the metric system as opposed to the standard system. I was taught in the standard. I used it. So no, I probably won't be studying the metric system in any substantial way. So even though it might be better, but now I do use the text, Hebrew and Greek, because it's easier for me than this endless banter. So I just want to know what the text said, and that's been interesting. But this man that I really came to admire about the Y2K fiasco, he talked about instant experts and false authorities. He quoted Mark Twain. He said, they're such remarkable people, they get so great a return of conclusion from the most trifling input of fact. And something we've learned at Landmark especially is when someone begins to talk about something, let's say it's creation or pre-trib, or let's say it's who knows what all the topics are now, we just kind of pause and say, what's the text we're discussing? And then in the text we'll say, well, let's go to our What's the meaning of that word that we're discussing? What's the meaning from the Bible? Let's define our terms. Let's document where this information was derived, and then let's defend it from the text. Well, that's really not a lot of fun. I don't blame people today who say, look, I'll take Jesus and a couple of good songs to go, please, and then they get on with their lives. But to actually have your life ordered or scripted by the text, now that's really not something any of us, according to the wills of our flesh and our mind, are inclined to do. For example, people define marriage for themselves. Everyone does. We at Landmark, for example, we don't do weddings for straight people. We don't do weddings for gay people. You say, well, what are you talking about? Well, weddings in a church are for people born from above. And that finds all of us in the same situation. We have first to have a new mind, a new heart, a new spirit, and recognize that when the Bible talks about marriage, it's talking about a divine union between two people born from above. So it's a very unique thing. Now, others in the civilized society will debate and banter, and marriage is considered a union between two people. The disputed in our society today is which two people, how many times can they marry? Are they both male? Are they both female? Should they be male? Should they be female? Well, for us, our text is a lot more specific than that. It's not something that we have then to conjure for ourselves. And what we may prefer for ourselves, that's relinquished when we come to Christ, because only He gives us the power to live the life that would match the Scriptures. But instant experts and false authorities, I mean, it's just better that way. Like, I've heard people start an argument over pre-trib or mid-trib or post-trib, and then nobody really in the room care that no one knows what the text actually says, but the argument was very energized. So if it were serious, when it comes to, let's say, the gospel, sometimes they'll stop and say, yes, we probably want to check that out. But let's be fair in our attribution. False authority, as this brilliant man said, sounds very similar to false prophet. And of course, in the Bible, a false prophet was one who was dishonest, unreliable, and invalid in much of what he said. Yeah, it wasn't correct. It didn't match reality. If he forecast something, it didn't come to pass, well, there were harsh consequences in the Old Testament, for sure, under the law, if you were under a theocracy, which Christians do not advocate a theocracy, because we know that man in the flesh, as we are, according to the wills of our mind and our flesh, would be very flawed in overseeing the theocracy, and only Christ, when He comes back bodily, as we teach, which is really a good stipulation. Unless Jesus is here on the earth, God is in the flesh, then only He has the prerogative to run His theocracy. So even atheists are thankful that we teach that. Even secular humanists are thankful that we teach that, because even they, once we teach them, can say, well, you don't have to worry about the Christians, because unless God comes back in the flesh and He sits on a throne in the Middle East, on the throne of David, and begins to rule literally, then they won't take it upon themselves to presume the right that's only ordained by the state. That's right. So it doesn't matter if you agree with the doctrine of the return of Christ. It's the premise upon which why no theocracy is supported today by Christians. But false prophets, good news for us in America is they just talk. They're just it's not like if they say an earthquake's coming and 3 weeks from now and they sell their books and then it doesn't happen. We don't go take the money back. We don't sue the person. The courts won't care if you were gullible enough to buy his book. He'll just review and revise it and come up with a new calamitous date. It's good marketing. It's fun. It's just not fun if you spent your money or lost your job. False prophets, they're mentioned in Matthew. They're mentioned in 2 Peter. They're mentioned in 2 Corinthians. False authority, probably is an older concept than what we probably would think. Fake curriculum, this is mental constructs that we just keep layering on top of others, kind of like an onion. We just keep building it. I do know that had a lot of people care enough about me to stop me from justifying my previous statement. So if I say something, then I layer it with justification. And you'll see someone who, let's say they really don't have a foundation, a text to lead out from with something they teach. And then when you challenge them or you really want to understand it, I've noticed religious people, talkers especially, fake authorities, false experts, can become very emotional if you do one of two things: believe them and want to understand, or disbelieve them and tell them they don't understand. But I like to believe what people say first and let them tell me. And then when you find out they don't really have a rationale, they don't really have a text, the meanings don't come from the Bible, they couldn't tell you what the Hebrew said or what the Greek says, or even why they don't know what it says, it really gets emotional. But this fake curriculum is without a book. There is no text. It's textless. Witnessed to several people that were in a cult once, and they were telling me about their book, and I said, well, can I look it up in a dead language like biblical Hebrew or Koine Greek? No, can't look it up. I said, so what do the words mean? Well, they don't know either. So there were 4 or 5 of them standing there talking with me. So I said, well, without consulting with each other, let's take a text. And we did. And I said, I can look that text up in the biblical Hebrew, tell you what it means, tell you the way it's inflected. I can give you all that can be known about that text, and then just stop there. I said, but not any one of you can agree with the other one on what that text says, because you have no text to go back to. So it was somewhat of a shake for them of their schema. It kind of rattled their mental construct to realize that there may have been 5 of them and just 1 of me, but I had a text and I had meanings that came from that established, let's say, forever ancient text, and they didn't have anything. So when it occurred to them they had a text-less faith, which most of things we believe, if we really don't check it out, we're the same way. So this is the thesis of false authority. The false authority, he says, this is his thesis: assumed knowledge undetected is preferred to knowledge acquired and detected. Well, why is that? Well, because if he assumes knowledge and it's undetected, that is, no one notices that he's just assuming, that he's not defining his terms, he's not documenting his terms, and he's not really even defending, he's just touting. That's preferred, and all of us are like that. Now, that's not to go, I'm not like pointing someone out and say they're a false prophet. No, just listen to what they say. Did he define his term from the Bible? Which, no. There's entire denominations that have been founded, and you can't ask 2 of them at the same time what a meaning of the word, even in their denominational title, because they've never considered defining the term from the Bible. They couldn't tell you the document. They couldn't tell you the book, chapter, and verse, for example, from which it was derived. They couldn't tell you that it was from biblical Hebrew or was it from Koine Greek. They can't tell you about the lexicon from which they derived the meaning. And it's okay, it's preferred. And look at everyone that's an expert. Wherever you've ever worked, every gas station, every factory, every retail store, every grocery store, mom and pop theology, it's everywhere. And people are really getting nasty if you don't give them the title of authority, meaning that they are the authority upon which their assertions are based. And if you don't recognize that, some people get really irrational. So it really is a tell-all when people become emotional about something. It tells you, first of all, that they know they haven't defined it from the text. They know they can't document it, and they know they can't defend it. They just kind of like to talk, and that's okay. It's harmless. But maybe when it comes to the gospel, it gets really serious. But now there's a form of deductive reasoning where you have a major premise, minor premise, and a conclusion. That's a logical syllogism. And today we have this rate of information. It's an onslaught, and it's unimaginable. We get cognitive overload. We have data overload. People say, well, how do I sort things out? Well, we're in an age where it is easier to just know Greek and Hebrew than to sort through the vastness of all the data out there. Or it's easier for me. I didn't say learning how to use those languages was easy. I'm saying usage of them is easier than all the endless talk out there. Since everyone knows little, a few can pretend to know lots. And that's kind of what I was saying earlier. It is kind of fun to just be an expert. I mean, you get to go to lunch with people, they buy your coffee. While they'll admire you, knowing that the person they're despising or belittling or diminishing is actually more trained in that field. Can you imagine if we got to, in high school, we could go to the break room and ridicule our math teacher because we know better than he does, and then we could go in and give him our answers and our mathematical equations and our procedures for solving, and he would have to accept it because there's more of us than he. Well, that would have been fun, I guess. And then we could have had the pre-trib math class. We could have the mid-trib math class. We could have had little groups in the school. It doesn't work that way. Everyone knows when you take math, what we don't like about it is it tells us what we must do to come to the answer that is required of the formula. And that's like, oh my, no one wants to be scripted. So, since so few people are out there that know a lot of people can pretend to know a lot of things. And really there's nothing people can do about it. It's not anything that we should worry about. So here's a conclusion from that reality is he says, a few liars spreading pseudo-knowledge, that's knowledge assumed rather than learned, can convince a lot of truthful believers that wrong is right, rhetoric is research, opinion is fact, and false choice is decision making. So that's enough for now for this. I've gone a little long than usual. I'll pick up here, and this will just be Text or Talk video number 1, part 1. But learn to laugh at some of the things you say, and learn to laugh at maybe your own indifference toward really defining a word. That's really 101 in hermeneutics. And if you do want to know what the Bible says, the text itself, you can know that. It's just, remember, there are so few people who even want to know what the text actually says, that then to acquire the ability to learn what it actually says, you just find yourself, it's a diminishing return. There's less and less people. You'll be standing out in a field by yourself. But the good news is, it's worth it, because there's a lot of good people out there that really would like to know from people who have the character and the disposition to define their term, document their term, and then defend it, because then they can have some stability in a world of chaos. So that's enough, and let's end with that good news that we do have scriptures, we do have definitions, we do have documents, and we can defend the faith.